Let me begin by thanking the Public Service Center for inviting me to participate today and share my thoughts with you. Thank you very much. When I got up at 4 a.m. this morning to prepare my presentation, I asked myself, what is it that I want to do? What is it that I want to do? I teach on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday mornings. And I use PowerPoint. And I have beautiful slides of where I work in the mountains. And I deliberately wore a pinstripe suit to contradict the images of me in my boots, in my knapsack, on horseback doing the work that we do, or on super meetings. And I did it deliberately knowing where I'm going because of the kinds of statements I wanted to make today. So I chose not to use PowerPoint, not because I don't value these pictures and these images, but I don't want to convey the idea that I am sharing data with you, because I don't want to do that. I'm not sharing data and case studies from our research. What I would like to do instead is to share my reflections, share my perspectives after 20 consecutive years of applied research in the Circumpolar Arctic, in the boreal forest, in the northern forest, and in mountainous communities. Continuous years. And so I want to be able to step back, and I think after 20 years is a long time in anyone's life. I think after 20 years, I'd just like to share my perspectives with you. And therefore, they will be my opinions based on my reflections on what I've seen. And a PowerPoint is not conducive to that. And so I thought instead, as I penned my thoughts at 4 a.m. this morning, I thought I would just share my thoughts with you instead of having a formal presentation. So I apologize. So why should we think about students speaking truth to power? So I want to spend the first part addressing that question. Why focus on students? And what is it about the work that my graduate students, my 8 graduate students now as of last week, 8 instead of 9, and I work with Indigenous communities? How do we integrate that based on our work in high mountainous areas, at high altitudes, from the Sinian Mountains to Ethiopia, to the Pamir and the Altai and Tian Mountains in Central Asia, as well as in high latitudes, in Arctic and northern forest communities. So why address the issue of students? And then the second question, how? What are the principles that would guide us to how we should speak truth to power? And you notice that I qualified it by saying thoughtfully, with humility and with grace. Because power does not like to hear. And so sometimes grace and humility are key elements in making sure that one is heard. So with that qualification, let me begin with why should we teach students to speak truth to power with humility and grace? The 21st century presents us a triumvirate of challenges: a global environmental crisis, an energy crisis, and an economic crisis. And these are not separate, they are fundamentally linked. Geologists are calling this epoch the Anthropocene, the new age of man. And it isn't a compliment. It is an admission of our culpability, of the damage that we are capable of causing. Where humanity is not only a socio-cultural force, not only an ecological force, but a geophysical force that puts all life on this planet in peril. So we are operating in a delusional haze where our economic objectives are completely out of context with our biophysical reality. We are now in a no analog state, a state where we don't have reference points. And there are no models or formulaic equations, although I would love to have some, but there are no models and formulaic equations that can get us out of this predicament. So we need to think about mechanisms to address this predicament. So this predicament presents us with what is called wicked problems. Now, wicked problems are not inherently evil. They are problems that defy easy solutions. They are difficult to perceive. Think about climate change. Think about the hole in the ozone as a result of chlorofluorocarbons. They are difficult to perceive. Think about the effect of DDT. They are difficult to perceive. But I would like to point out that among the first people to perceive the changes to sea ice were in fact indigenous peoples in the Circumpolar Arctic. That's something we should keep in mind and ask ourselves why. Anyway, these wicked problems are difficult to perceive. And they resist solutions because of constantly changing circumstances, because the situation is dynamic. And these problems are highly context dependent. And they are characterized by scientific uncertainty. So we can't turn around if, let's say, the director of the environment, or the director of the National Park Service, or the secretary of the Interior, or whoever asks for help. And we say, well, wait a minute. We need 30 years of data first. These are emergent problems. These are emergent problems that demand answers now, and they are characterized by scientific uncertainty. It means that people like you and I have to take risks every time we open our mouths, because we may not have the data with us. Because they are highly context dependent, there are conflicting perceptions and values about the nature of the problem. There are parts of the United States, the most powerful country in the world, still thinking that climate change is a farce. So there are these conflicts based on values. And therefore, wicked problems demand collaborative responses. They demand collaborative responses. Even having those in the room who think that climate change is a farce. I'm one of the few people who think it is our fault, the fault of the scholars who do research, that we have not been successful in communicating with people who disagree with us. Instead of demonizing them, perhaps we should enter their church halls, their community centers, wearing a pinstripe suit and saying, shall we discuss? When addressing a wicked problem, expertise is not enough. I am a Cornell professor is not enough. Diversity is essential to wicked problems. So imagine a mountain range, and the peaks are the optimal solutions to that wicked problem. And we are in darkness because we are in a no analog state. Diversity and expertise together start shining a light onto those peaks and valleys. And diversity allows us to map out the multiple optimal solutions. Because as soon as we find one optimality, we realize that there is another optimality, because the circumstances are changing. So I think it is very important that we recognize that expertise is not sufficient, that diversity of experiences, perspectives, and ways of knowing in responding to wicked problems is essential. And I'm not speaking about diversity the way it is characterized on the Cornell webpage, where we pick a certain gender, a certain sex, or we pick a certain ethnicity. I'm speaking of diversity in its substantive way, in terms of cognitive diversity and depth of experience. The other element is that because of the nature of the wicked problem, and because the importance of diversity, the research that is applied has to be participatory, where the communities of inquirers, including the high school students sitting in the back there, work with communities of social practice. And that there is this constant engagement with each other. And in fact, the communities of social practice are sending their young kids to join the communities of inquirers, where identities are complex and not singular, but multidimensional. Problems like climate change, problems like structural poverty, problems like food and energy sovereignty are wicked problems. So, if we have the Anthropocene and wicked problems, then where is the hope? Where is the methodology of hope in all of this? Because if I'm teaching Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, every day the stuff, then Friday could become suicidal. Especially with no sun. I can take minus 30 centigrade. It's the sun that, the absence of sun that gets to me. I love playing outside, but let's have some sun. So where is the methodology of hope? Where is the sun? In my experience of teaching and research, students and indigenous communities have been the fundamental source of hope. And I would like you to think about this both in a utilitarian sense, in terms of a necessity, but also in an ethical sense. How does it make sense ethically? This is the reason why my students and I work with indigenous communities at high latitudes and high altitudes. Indigenous communities have faced a history of colonization and imperialism of proportions that are beyond imagination. Yet they have survived tremendous devastation, tremendous depopulation. They have survived genocide and have turned around and shown agency. Even as we were doing our climate change research, we were already seeing communities observing changes in weather patterns and quickly showing agency to work around the difficulties that we are facing. And remember, climate change does not arrive when life was hunky-dory. We already have a dramatic problem where there is gender inequality. We have tremendous difficulties associated with economic access and distribution. We have significant difficulties associated with food systems. And then on top of that, there is climate change. So it is exacerbating the issue. That's why it's such a wicked problem. And these communities where we work, they are fundamentally linked to their ecological habitat. That's why they were able to see the nuances in weather patterns, in changes in their habitats, in life cycles of creatures that they are connected to. And Where these communities are, despite a history of imperialism, humanity continues to seek to exploit the resources, whether it's hydropower, whether it's lithium, whether it's oil and gas, whether it is strategic minerals, where these communities continue to live. And these communities are at the vanguard of the climate change. Communities in the Arctic, northern regions, communities at high altitudes are at the vanguard. They see the effect immediately. So this is not just an issue of an interesting research problem. This is an ethical issue. It is an issue about justice. And you just mentioned that Cornell has celebrated its 150 years as a land-grant university. Yes, I'm a Canadian, but I pay my taxes here in the United States under the global tax regime. And there would be no endowed school for Cornell had Ezra Grant not held on to the land, which was not in New York State, by the way, and then sold it, and then endowed the endowed school. So there is an ethical responsibility from all sides of Cornell, not just the land grant. So this is an issue about justice. So what is the role of students and their teachers? Well, we have evidence that the millennial generation is in fact a socially committed generation, despite it. They're a highly connected and socially committed generation. And evidence is indicating that they like to work together. They like to work collaboratively in teams. We also know that they are the source of change in paradigms. Thomas Kuhn, in the 60s, wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And just before he died in 1996, this was republished with the new foreword and the new afterword. And buried in that book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he explains that the one that undertakes the paradigm shift tends to be young and comes from outside, from diversity of experiences. Interesting. Thomas Kuhn wasn't writing about science. He was writing about physics, the movement from mechanistic physics to quantum physics. So we also know that it is our young people that change paradigms. Therefore, despite the model, the increasing model of universities in the 21st century that look at students as clients, in fact, students are not just consumers of information, they are producers of insight. So together, they provide both the communities that we work with and the students that we work with. So how do we teach students to speak truth to power with humility and grace? You can't teach something that you yourself cannot do. And therefore, practice is fundamental to any teaching. I would like to share three principles. I would like to put forward three principles that I would argue are essential to creating that. One is a commitment to biophilia, the love of life. The second is commitment to intellectual pluralism, embracing diversity, embracing difference. And third is a commitment to participatory research approaches. But first, biophilia, love of life. Yet, the term biophilia was popularized by the evolutionary and conservation biologist from Harvard, E.O. Wilson, the Ant-Man. But actually, in 1964, Eric Fromm first talked about biophilia in the context of universities. He argued that it is the role of the scholar to promote the love of life. And I'd like to give you an example. In 1936, at the University of Salamanca, and you know, universities are safe places where people of different opinions and perspectives are able to share with each other and potentially those that they disagree with their view. In 1936, the fascist general Milan Astray was speaking at the University of Salamanca. And the rector of the university, whom I will mention in a moment, sat quietly and created a situation where there could be engagement. And General Milan Astray went as far as saying, down with the intellect and with intellectuals. And that was fine. He was offered a safe place to present his point of view. But when he concluded his speech, he repeated that, down with intellectuals and the intellect. And his supporters in black shirts sitting in the back shouted, long live death. Long live death. And you know, there are members of our society that celebrate death and mayhem. And at that point, the rector, Miguel de Unamuno, the famous Spanish philosopher, got up and said, you have crossed the line. Here at the university, we celebrate life. Now you're strong and you're brutal, and you may be able to injure us, but you have crossed the line and we will not support you. This is not what a university is about. That's where biophilia began its engagement in Europe. Now I want to share an example of biophilia in another way. The Inuit on Victoria Island, on the western Arctic, on the western side of Victoria Island, had not come into contact with Europeans until much more recent. So the devastation of influenza and tuberculosis was later, in the 60s. And it was devastation. It was devastation. Anyway, the first time William Stefansson, the explorer, Dartmouth College has his diaries and his works, arrived, the Inuit on Victoria Island, the Inuvialuit, which simply means real person, Inuvialuit, real person, stopped him. They had never seen somebody like that before. So they said, wait at the outskirts of our village. We need to make sure that you're a human being, because we've never seen somebody like you before. They went back. They got maktak, whale blubber, their staple, and they offered it to him. And he ate it. He said, you're a human being. Welcome. You're welcome to stay with us. And this is how William Stefansson moved across Victoria Island and then Ellesmere Island and so on and so forth. But I'd like you to think about that for a minute. A stranger arrives, and I would like you to think about, let's say a stranger arrived in upstate New York, at a farmhouse, or in Texas on Halloween. How would he be or she be treated? Now, by the way, I do like Texas. I'm from Alberta. And they're very polite. But how would a stranger be treated? The way the Inuvialuit treated him was by offering him food, established his humanity, and then took him in. What better way to promote life than to share food? When he left, the Inuit said to him, "Think good." Now, William or Stephenson misunderstood. He thought there's some kind of superstition. But what they were telling him is, if you keep on thinking good thoughts about us and about others, then everybody will act well, because thought is the first form of action. And he interpreted it in his diaries and in his work as superstition. But they were saying, think good. They kept on telling him that when he was leaving. The second principle I would like to refer to is intellectual pluralism. The challenges that humanity faces now do not fit neatly into any single disciplinary silo, because they are wicked problems. Now, something interesting happened, and again I will return to Victoria Island and then move westward to Alaska, across the Bering Sea to the Chukotka Peninsula with this example. And I want you to imagine that's the reason why I didn't put up any PowerPoint today. Because this is our planet. And we need to be able to imagine it in our heads as we talk about it. The whole planet is ours, not just the United States or Canada. At the dawn of the third millennium, we have some really interesting evidence that subsistence hunting is not a relic of any bygone era, but is relevant to cultural diversity and human survival in the 21st century. What am I talking about? In the 1990s, soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you have to keep in mind that compared to the Canadian Arctic and the Alaskan Arctic, the most industrialized part of the Arctic was the Soviet Union. They had populations of 500,000 people north of the Arctic Circle. Imagine keeping so many people alive north of the Arctic Circle, where just doing this to the lichen is 1,000 years of damage to the land. Or going on my quad and ripping across the tundra is irreparable to the habitat. 500,000 in Murmansk. The names of towns are like nickel, because that's what they're mining there, nickel. So, very high population, collapse of the Soviet Empire, and food supplies stop going north, and fuel supplies stop going north. Now remember, this is 70 years of collectivization. So, the Yupik and the Chukchi on the Chukotka Peninsula potentially face starvation, freezing to death, or both. Something very interesting happened. The Inuit in the Eastern Arctic, the Inuvialuit in the Western Arctic, and the Inupiaq in Alaska rented a Hercules aircraft from the US Army, piled it with emergency supplies, and sent it across the Bering Sea. It wasn't the United Nations. It was not the World Food Program. But yes, they were sending emergency aid to people across the Bering Sea, whom they considered part of their family. That's an interesting lesson for the dawn of the 21st century. By the way, this also happened in Central Asia. communities from elsewhere rushed to the support of communities in mountainous regions without UN or major governmental assistance. They acted like civil society institutions. But the Inupiat didn't stop there. They sent weapons across. Then they established a program where Russian scientists and Inuit hunters would come over a 10-year period to develop resource management strategies using the language of the Department of Interior. What was apparent is that when there was a fuel shortage and a food shortage, the ability to hunt and fish was the way to keep people alive at the dawn of the 21st century. And the Inupiat provided assistance to facilitate that by training hunters, because that knowledge had been lost or had contracted. They went to the International Whaling Commission, and I was there where the International Whaling Commission was meeting in Barrow, Alaska. They went to the International Whaling Commission. Now keep in mind, who are the members of the International Whaling Commission? The very countries that took the stalks of whale, using their language, the stalks of whales to extinction. And look at the irony. An indigenous community is now coming to them and saying, look, we hunt the bowhead whale, and we have our quotas that you have given us, and you have set rules on how much and how we hunt. They traditionally hunt the gray whale. We're asking you to give them a quota of 2 gray whales a year so that we can stave off starvation, because one whale feeds entire communities, not just once, several times, and successfully negotiate a quota. This is another interesting example, one of biophilia, the other of a different way of knowing, relevant in the 21st century to survival. I want to come to the third principle, which I suspect is the favorite of this particular center, participatory research approaches. But I'm not making the argument purely on ideological grounds. I'm making the argument on ethical and intellectual grounds. Addressing wicked problems requires social consensus, because we have to agree that this is the optimal solution we're seeking when we find that something else goes wrong. Let me use the example of DDT. Mosquitoes are a problem. Malaria is a problem. How we deal with that, we need to have consensus. Because mosquito is also an important creature to the ecosystem. So, addressing wicked problems requires social consensus, and expertise is not sufficient. Diversity of perspectives is essential, and therefore different ways of knowing is essential to addressing wicked problems. Participatory research achieves this intellectual pluralism. We're not only a humanist and a social scientist are in conversation with a biophysical scientist, but all three are in a conversation with the hunter, the farmer, the pastoralist. Participatory research achieves that, where communities of inquirers and communities of practice can work together. And when we talk about participatory research, that does not negate the use of GIS, the use of satellite data, because those are methods. Participatory research is an approach. It is a perspective, it's an attitude. And then there are certain methodological tools. And that kind of research is where communities participate in the research process, set the research agenda, own the research results, and implement the findings. Two of my PhD students are on their way to defending. One just defended successfully, the other one is on his way. Before they could return home, they had to return the results in the language to the people that they had been working with. That meant curriculum material, that meant policy for management of medicinal plants. That meant information that we gathered about plant relations to food systems. That had to be returned first to the people where it came from, so it could be implemented. Then to come here and then defend. All my research on climate change has been driven by the communities that we work with. It was the Inupiat that said we should do work on climate change. I assure you, it is not a subject that I enjoy. But because we had a partnership in the early 1990s, the data showed that we needed to examine this. Similarly, our work in mountainous regions that is related to climate change was driven and directed by the communities because they said this is the issue we need to address. They didn't call it climate change or global warming. They're saying something is wrong with the weather. We need to build capacity to understand. Because the Anthropocene is a no analog state, there is lack of predictability. And due to continuous changing weather patterns in the north as well as at high altitudes, this is impacting food systems and livelihoods. And when you think of mountain societies, we're not just talking about the village, we're talking about the entire region. Because these small landholders or farmers or pastoralists are supplying food to the entire system. And so it has a dramatic impact on livelihood and food systems. That anxiety, that lack of predictability is causing stress. Just think about it. Many of you are faculty here. That means you are engaged somehow with TIA craft. I hope I'm saying it right. Craft, whatever it is, who invest in the market. And you and I both know that Mr. Bush spent $500 billion plus on Wall Street to protect the very people that put us in the financial crisis. And Mr. Obama spent more than him, but the New York Times doesn't report it, protecting Wall Street. Why? Now, we could take a cynical point of view and say, well, they're all corrupted. Or we could say they needed stability. They needed stability. Overnight, all these liberal-minded professors would become very conservative if their TIA craft was effective. Let's be honest. Right? They needed stability. Now imagine that for the farmer, when we have this constantly changing weather pattern. The problem with climate change is not the change, because if there's just one change, we can anticipate it. It's the fact that it is constantly changing. There is no anticipatory capacity. So we found some interesting evidence since 2006. We have been acting upon it since 2008, and we've finally achieved, we're moving towards achieving something in 2015. I want to share this last example. In the Pamir Mountains, we found evidence of historical calendars. These calendars are ecological calendars. They measure time with respect to ecology. Now, there is evidence here in other mountainous areas of such ecological calendars. But in the Pamirs, the farmers and herders integrated their activities with their ecological surroundings. And they told time with reference to phenological signs. So, flowering of a particular plant, arrival of a migratory bird, appearance of a particular insect, and they could tell time. They measured time. And we had heard about that in 2006 when we were doing our research. They kept on making reference to this calendar, saying, no, when we use this calendar, we had things correct. Because it was not a concrete Julian or a Gregorian calendar. It was a flexible calendar that was moving with ecology. So we looked at ethnographic data in Russia, and we found that the Russians had also documented this. But they were not able to explain why there were so many different calendars, because they didn't match. We went to ancient manuscripts, and this is about one expert is not enough. We needed to find people who could read the manuscripts. So we went to 500-year-old Persian manuscripts. We saw evidence of the calendar there. We interviewed people. They talked about the calendar. And we found that these ecological calendars were context-specific and based on cultural niche and ecological niche along the altitude. And we found that diverse ethnicities and diverse ecological professions, herders, farmers, hunters, all use these calendars. And they had a grounded mechanism of telling time and anticipating change, climate change, seasonally. And that these calendars were integrated and highly adaptive, so there were different calendars, even 1,000 meters apart between villages. Our research is indicating, and when I'm saying our, I'm not just referring to my students and I'm referring to the communities that are our partners. Our research is indicating that these calendars can be revitalized. That in fact, if we abandon the Gregorian calendar for a minute and used an ecological calendar, we might be able to anticipate change. And there is a subtle difference between predicting and anticipating. When we are predicting, we're saying, I know the future. When we're anticipating, we're saying, we are ready for the future. We're talking about anticipating. So, now these calendars, because of war, 33 years of continuous war in Afghanistan, and Soviet oppression on the other side of the river, these calendars fell into use. In fact, they were encouraged not to use them under the command economy because of collectivization. A different economic system was implemented. And so knowledge of these calendars was lost in many ways. We believe that these calendars may be a mechanism of building anticipatory capacity. So last year, and this year is when the challenge was given, last year we began collaboration with the American Geophysical Union. Now remember, you heard, I come from the humanities and social sciences. The American Geophysical Union is neither American nor a union. It has 62,000 members around the world from 144 countries. They phoned and said, you know, we hear that you're trying to work with communities, and we're interested in doing that too. Is there somewhere we can help you? I said, of course there is. We need climate science knowledge that is humble enough to work with. And remember, climate change makes us all humble. And And so they said, yes, we're game. We're ready to work with you. They went to the MIT's Collective Intelligence Lab. And MIT, in its own style, said, we know how to solve this. We will put out, they have 33,000 members, this Collective Intelligence Lab. We will put out a challenge. And we will do it on the web, and anybody and everybody can then put in proposals to how to respond to this challenge. So with respect to participatory research, there are multiple ways to engage. And we have just begun this process. The challenge was made at the end of December. The proposals, I'm told we now have 11 proposals for how we could build anticipatory capacity. These proposals can come from scholars, from research teams, from classes, high school classes, university classes, from individuals. We have people saying, you know, what if we created a game using cell phones, because everybody uses cell phones. But it's a real game. We're taking pictures and sending text messages showing the phenological differences. Other scholars are saying, well, we have enough biodiversity data plants from the mountains stored in other places around the world. What if we looked at the herbariums and collected that data and matched it with the calendars and see if we can revitalize? Other NGOs are suggesting, what if we work with the teachers in high schools? And the schools started revitalizing the calendar. 11 such proposals. And so I invite you to look at the Climate Collab at MIT. And if you're interested, just send me a note and I will send you the webpage. And there are proposals that are going forward. So here is an example of community participation, where the community is saying, all right, let's try and focus on this, on anticipatory capacity. What can you offer? And we're turning around and saying, well, we don't know what we can offer, let's ask. And let's ask globally. So there are many ways to build such partnerships. So why engage students to speak truth to power through teaching and research? Because they and the communities are the methodology of hope for the 21st century. If we don't want to be suicidal, if we don't want to be like the fascists in 1936 that celebrated death, if we want to pursue life and biophilia, then they are the methodology of hope. Indigenous communities have experienced and continue to experience dramatic change. And they are biophilia par excellence. They present alternative ways of knowing. And students change paradigms. It is just action when our students and their teachers engage with communities, indigenous communities, or even local farming communities. So, really, my question was all about hope, because this is really about hope. On that note, I'll stop.
We open up for questions. A few minutes. Yes.
You were talking about how fascists celebrated death in the early, what about looking at it from the perspective that they're actually just celebrating that life is just sort of a dark poetry, and that's just naturally gonna, like any culture that gets like obsessed with like technological advancement and like abstraction in academia is just like naturally going to get destroyed in some way, and that it's like we're sort of killing ourselves anyway by doing that, and that it's just how for the greater good to just sort of like, it's sort of
But let me,
celebration of death. It's like
yeah,
accepting the reality of how, you know, like,
is, yeah. Maybe you've been reading Kafka a lot. It was pretty interesting. So, so that's not where I come from. There was a word that you used that was really interesting. You said naturally. This is a natural extinction. And that's an interesting word because we have tried to separate ourselves from nature. And I would argue with you that we are fundamentally natural, even in this building. Just like spiders build webs, just like rivers filter, we build things. Some of them we build them well, and some of them are very destructive. But we haven't ceased to be natural at that moment. We are still biological beings as we're doing it, except that we're being destructive. So I understand the part where we are destructive. You're right that the planet will continue with or without us. It will be severely changed, but it will continue with or without us. The perspective that I have, and that's the point where Miguel de Unamuno drew the line, is that I believe it is the role of universities and educational institutions to promote life. And that life, when promoting it, has to be fundamentally thoughtful about the consequences of the technologies it creates, the ideas that it creates. And so I have a very simple answer to your very complicated question. But I, after having seen massive amount of death, look at where I work in Central Asia, also in the Arctic. Massive amount of ugliness